So we've talked about the mechanics of mating in plants, and we've talked about the kinds of pollinators, kind of the general pollinator relationship with biotic pollinators. And today's topic allows us to get, I think, a little bit more under the surface and look at the whole mating process from the plant's perspective, as far as maybe optimizing its reproductive output in a variety of circumstances. So plants have a lot of neat tricks that are beyond just the consideration of who comes to visit their flowers and who delivers the pollen. There's a lot more going on, and part of it's shown already in this first slide here. I've got a single species and two flowers of the same species, and I covered it up a little bit with text, but maybe you could see in there something is different about these two flowers that are basically connected at almost the same place. So two flowers of the same species. And what is different? Well, on the right here, we've got, let's start on the left. On the left here, this is the female structure. This is the style capped by the stigma at the bottom. And so that here is ready to receive pollen. Now, at the time that happens, this other part of the flower has anthers that have not yet dehisced. So they have not burst open to reveal their pollen. This is a flower that is able to receive pollen, but is not right now delivering pollen. It's not giving away any pollen. On the right-hand side, we have a flower that still has a style right there, capped by a stigma, kind of behind there. And those anthers, in addition to dehissing, now you can see their grainy pollen on the outside. In addition to that, they've gotten longer. So they got longer and they came out here right up to the same level as the stigma. So we'll cover that as a concept. Maybe right now you can think about what it means or what that might do to benefit the reproduction in this plant. So I like to think about this as a question of plants having the option to go really any place on this, what I'm calling tongue-in-cheek here, the sexual spectrum. Plants can fall on the side over here called reproductive assurance, which is basically making sure that they are setting seed, that they're getting fertilization done, really regardless of who it's with, and sometimes, as it's possible in flowers, doing that with themselves. So here we have the divinals, I touch myself. On the other end of the spectrum is I want your sex. So we have plants that are maybe insisting on reproducing with other individuals. So a lot of this comes out of the fact that we have plants with hermaphroditic flowers or bisexual flowers. They have male parts and female parts on the same flower. They can reproduce with themselves, or they can ensure that they have to reproduce with a different individual. Over here on reproductive assurance is a form of pollination called selfing or self-pollination. We did last time the difference between pollination and fertilization. So self-pollination, as we'll see, does not always result in self-fertilization. So pollination sometimes does not result in fertilization. The other side over here, this is a form called outcrossing. So just in kind of shorthand, selfing on the left to outcrossing on the right. And we're going to see a variety of ways that plants can make this happen. Just to drive the point home that there are lots of plants doing lots of strategies. This is from a study that was combining a lot of evidence from a lot of different plant species. And shown on the x-axis is the population outcrossing rate. So from 0 to 1. So outcrossing, again, this is basically that sexual spectrum I was mentioning. So on the right hand is full outcrossing. Every individual makes sure to mate with an individual that's a different plant. All the way over here to 0, zero outcrossing means that those plants are always, or the number is close to 0, almost always mating with themselves. So plants as a species, they get it done either way. And there are genetic effects to consider, there are population effects to consider, but just every possible kind of variation on this is found in plants. So just a couple plants illustrated here. They don't necessarily look one way or the other. We've got an example here, one of the plants that's closer to the bottom, mostly selfing, Aquilegia canadensis, coming out about there. And then this is a Narcissus species, right about there is the mostly outcrossing group. So we'll talk about some forms of variation here. One form of the morphological variation that ensures selfing is this form called cleistogamous flowers. So cleisto is kind of, I think it's maybe related to closed, um, cloister, if you're familiar with that. So cleistogamous flowers, the gamous part there refers to marriage or to mating. So closed mating, cleistogamous. And it's a flower that's made that never opens. And it just makes the reproductive parts inside of the closed petals, illustrated nicely by a violet. You can find plants like this violet growing in Wisconsin. And they produce their flowers like this at the ground level or sometimes even below the ground level. They produce pollen, they have a functional female stigma, and they just pollinate themselves underground, at the ground level, no attracting animals required. And that is basically reproductive assurance. So the same plant might have these open flowers or chasmogamous flowers, but it also has some of these backup flowers. So basically, this plant prefers to make some seeds if it can get some pollination done for the showy flowers and get pollen delivered by an animal from a different plant. That's the best, possibly genetically, that ensures some variation. But if that doesn't happen, this plant can jumble up its own genetic variation and generate some seeds by selfing. Another example of closed up flowers are in the bottle gentian. It's one of our gentians that at maturity, you see these purple flowers and they just aren't open. And it's a little misleading because there are pollinators that are able to open those. So this is a bumblebee here using its tough strength to break those petals apart. This is a form of pollinator exclusion, something related to what we saw last time with pollination syndromes. So this would be the signals that tell this particular pollinator, like, yeah, this is your kind of flower. You may not see the reward, but if you're clever, young bumblebee, you might be able to get a reward out of here. And sure enough, they can. Other forms of evidence for this, we may not see exciting flowers that tell us that we've got self-pollination, self-fertilization, but you can run an experiment, as is illustrated here, to demonstrate that these flowers are self-fertilizing. So the measurement on the y-axis is the seed set per fruit. So basically how successful pollination is, how many of those ovules are fertilized. And in a intact population, so populations ranging from looks like about 20 individuals up to 2,000 individuals. Those populations have roughly the same seed set per fruit, regardless of population size. So a few plants growing together produce about 250 seeds per fruit. 1,000 plants growing together produce about 250 seeds per fruit. What's interesting about this is the effect you get if you emasculate. If you take away the pollen production from flowers, they should be able to receive pollen as long as there is pollen to be delivered. But what we discover in these black dots are that in smaller population sizes, as you might expect, small population means that if you're waiting on pollen to be delivered to you, there's not a lot of pollen being produced by your neighbor flowers, right? So in those cases, those plants are what we call pollen limited. They're not able to get enough pollen to fertilize all of their ovules. and the seed set suffers as a result. So basically, if they have their own pollen, then they will be able to fertilize themselves, and that would bring their seed production up to the normal level. But if they can't pollinate themselves and they're in a small population, then they're in trouble. So measured as population size or pollinator availability, kind of the same, two sides of the same coin. So smaller populations will be less attractive to pollinators and they'll have fewer pollinator visits. So why not pollinate yourself if nobody else is going to do it? Other forms of this are kind of like a backup plan. So I like this term reproductive assurance. It's basically if, again, like I mentioned with the violet, a lot of times we think about outcrossing as the preferred option, the better option. It maintains genetic variability. And really is the point of sexual reproduction is to get an opportunity to mix up genetic material from different individuals. That's a nice option, but let's say that's not possible. There are plants that have this backup system. And a lot of times, as I see here with delayed selfing, the flowers allow pollen to be delivered from somebody else first, from another flower. And then if that doesn't happen, or if it doesn't happen to the full extent that's possible, then these plants take care of themselves and they contact their pollen to the stigma. So that's actually being shown here. This is an older flower. As it's kind of finishing up its flowering period, the bits of the stigma, they curl back and they just basically touch themselves to the anthers. So autonomous here, I didn't mention that before, but autonomous is really in the absence of anybody else. So all by themselves, selfing all by themselves. This was from an interesting study that showed there's some variation in the populations as far as how effective they might be at doing this delayed selfing. So some of them, the stigmas come back and they clearly contact anthers. Other ones, like this one, might actually be prevented from doing that because there's this distance in between the location of the stigmas and the location of the anthers. And I suspect there's no accident, right? So these are populations that might be under selection for not selfing so much, or other ones that are maybe under selection for more reproductive assurance, autonomous selfing. Crazy strategies, lots of options. One of the terms that we can use to refer to this selfing avoidance, so this is not we saw previously delayed self-pollination. This is avoidance of self-pollination by, in this case, having the reproductive organs mature at different times. So dichogamy, a lot of terms, I'm afraid, in botany in general, and then pollination biology has quite a few terms. I guess I'd like you to know the concepts more than the terms. This is one, as I said, this is the difference in organs maturing in time. So I have a couple examples. On the top is a species of geranium, and going from earlier on the left to later on the right. So earlier, we have in the middle a style, and then up here is the region that will become the stigma, as you can see on the right, but it's not open yet. It's all closed up. That's the surface that the pollen would be able to stick to, and it's just sealed up and is hidden from the world. The anthers have burst open and they're ready to release their pollen. So a pollinator could come visit this flower, get a nectar reward, and pick up some pollen, but it wouldn't really be able to drop any pollen onto a stigma of this flower because there just ain't a stigma yet to be found. Later on, this one has a female phase kick on, and the stigma opens up and is able to collect pollen. So basically, this means that this flower has its male function first. It's able to export pollen earlier at a time when it's not receiving any pollen. At the later time, there might be some of this pollen is able to get onto the stigma. Could also be that this pollen has had its chance already and it's far away from the stigma and it's in less danger of self-pollination. But certainly at this later time of the flower, that's when this is receiving pollen that could be used for fertilization. Another contrast down here at the bottom has a different version, which is, we saw up here, male first. This one is female first. So this magnolia flower has, up here, these are these styles and stigmas ready to receive pollen before it's releasing any of its own pollen. So this is maybe a little cleaner version. Receive pollen. If somebody shows up to your flower carrying pollen, at this point, this flower can be sure that it's not pollen from itself. Now, later in time, the stigmas are probably still receptive, and now these anthers have dehisced and released some of their pollen. So female first, male later. Two versions of dichogamy, so male first or female first. Another word that sounds a lot like that is hercogamy. So that gammy part, again, referring to reproduction. And hercogamy is separation of organs in space. So located at different heights sometimes. So this is some long stamens with their anthers over here at quite some distance from the stigma. So short stigma, long stamens. Contrasted here, we've got a tall female structure with the stigma, and then lower down would be the anthers. So long female organs, short male organs, or long male organs, short female organs. What I'm trying to show on this one doesn't come through super well is that this style is actually deflected over to the side a little bit, off to the side. Other plants, so instead of just moving their organs off to the side or having them mature at different times, actually have them respond to the presence of pollinators. So a couple examples here. The mountain laurel, this is a plant that has these stamens tucked away in little pockets. So this is a flower that's fairly recently opened. And as a pollinator comes in, or a visitor comes in and collects nectar, trips these stamens and they whap the animal on the back. So they actually, in response to the presence of the pollinator, put their pollen on the back of that animal. That's one way to prevent the pollen from just being available to everyone and instead putting it on as needed. Another one that responds to the presence of pollinators is these monkey flowers. They have a stigma that's in two parts and it kind of looks like a pair of lips. And after they've been touched, they sense that and they actually close their two stigma parts together. So it's initially ready to receive pollen, but when that first pollen is deposited, after that point, it seals up and it greatly decreases the chance that any other pollen is going to land there. So I'll start with the monkey flower on the right here. So I mean, that's real time. That's really fast, huh? Touch and close. All right, other example here. This is described as jack-in-the-box stamens. So a person here is manipulating the flower with forceps, kind of mimicking what a foraging bird might do. So this is a South American, I think, species. So maybe a hummingbird, maybe another type of bird. But their presence is going to cause a little bit of a physical change in the flower here. Hello. Another one here.
Pollinating alfalfa flowers is a lot trickier than it looks. Even honeybees can't really hack it. Here's why. Alfalfa keeps its pollen locked away inside its flowers. To get it, the bees have to step on a spring-loaded pedal called a keel pedal. Here's how it works. Pop! It releases this column that has the pollen at the end. It's called tripping the flower. Here it is again. The column has some force. The bee might get a good thwack in the face. Leaf-cutting bees just don't care. They can take a punch. Pop. Pop. Honeybees don't really like to tangle with that. They'll usually step around gingerly, trying to sip nectar from the side without setting it off. Leaf-cutting bees get coated in pollen and bring it back home to their nest so they can pack it in there to feed their growing babies. Each one is bundled in a little leaf-wrapped bassinet. Aw, there they are. The siblings all lined up together. A new generation of the toughest little bees around.
Okay, so we've thought about a few different ways that plants can maybe keep from pollinating themselves and then possibly fertilizing themselves. And it's also worthwhile to think about flowers on plants. So plants are not necessarily like our animals you might be familiar with that have sexual organs stuck at one place for the whole individual. Flowers can be many flowers in on one plant. So that one plant producing flowers, those flowers on the same plant are genetically coming as the same individual, really. So they're genetically the same, I guess we could say. So they would produce pollen grains, regardless of the flower. The pollen grains produced by one plant are genetically from the same pool of genetic information. The ovules produced by that plant are from the same pool of genetic information. And so here's one of these other terms again. Geitonogamy is a term for pollination that involves transferring pollen between flowers that are on the same plant. So that genetically is really no different from self-pollination. So pollen going from one flower to itself as this autogamy, self-pollination, genetically not any different from transferring between flowers on the same plant. So two kinds of genetic self-pollination. And in contrast to that, we have this other term, xenogamy. So xeno is foreigners or outsiders. So that's pollination with somebody who's not the same plant. So I think it's just worthwhile to think about the many flowers on a plant. Outcrossing still has to involve another plant. Also relates to how pollinators will visit. Sometimes a bee will come and visit lots of flowers on this plant, and then only after visiting a few of them switch over to a different plant. So that has to be a consideration for that individual if it's trying to get pollen from somebody else. It's got to kind of avoid all the pollen from itself. So an extreme version of avoiding pollinating yourself is not to have any pollen. Ha, gotcha. So one extreme shown over on the right here, these are plants in the genus Nymphoides, ones that I've studied. And on the left are hermaphroditic flowers that have, in blue here, a functioning stigma, and in the orange here, functioning stamens. So with producing pollen and collecting pollen all in the same flower. And it's possible for flowers to figure out that they don't need one part or the other part. So these become unisexual flowers. So examples from the same species, this is a species that has unisexual female flowers on the top. This is the stigma ready to receive pollen. And it's a little, if you didn't know what was going on, you'd be forgiven for saying, wait a minute, look at those things. Those are indeed anthers, but they don't produce pollen. They don't break open to release the pollen. They are vestigial, so they're little bits of stamen that don't work as stamens anymore. So this is effectively a female flower. It's only able to collect pollen, and it has ovules at the base that can be fertilized after that process. The male counterpart, again, kind of looks like it has the female organ here, but it doesn't have a functioning stigma. So there's no chance of pollinating the ovules in there. I don't know if the ovules are fully developed even, but it is, of course, delivering pollen. So plants that want to make sure that they're not fertilizing themselves can devote their flowers to only receiving pollen or only delivering pollen. These happen to be on different plants. So there would be a female plant or a male plant. That's not the only way to do unisexual flowers in flowering plants either, but this is one way, and most similar from what we've seen today to what the familiar human version is. So human animals, males and females, two required. So besides this making male and female separate flowers, that takes some genetic change, requires downplaying the male function in some flowers and female functions in the other flowers. A little tricky to do, right? Because as a species, you still have to have the instructions for making all of those, but they have to get turned off somehow in one or the other individual. Another way to ensure outcrossing is more of a genetic component. Pretty neat process where in this case, it's called, it goes by the simple name of self-incompatibility. So I'm calling it genetic self-incompatibility, but it's often referred to as SI or self-incompatibility in flowering plants. And this is a process where the stigma, so the female receiving the surface that receives pollen, has a way to detect a signature, sort of a genetic signature produced by the pollen grains. So we have here basically a schematic of two different pollen grains that are landing. They might be pollen grains from the same species. So in theory, they're compatible with the female structure. But there's a system in place where the stigma can detect if they are too genetically similar. So here we've got a stigma that comes from a diploid individual that is S1, S3, these so-called S alleles, self-incompatibility alleles. And the S2 pollen is not, S2 is not any one of the alleles that's present on the females. So S2 is different from S1 and S3, and that is compatible pollen. This other pollen grain comes from an individual that is S1, and so S1 being the same as this S1 allele on the female, they recognize each other, and this is actually prevented from fertilizing. So here's the case where pollination is not going to lead to fertilization. So this is showing pollen grains that are basically arrested at the stigma. We don't see the pollen tubes growing, and they're just stuck in place. So those individuals would be prevented from fertilizing. These ones that are coming from the compatible individuals, the pollen tubes grow and everything's fine there. So this is kind of important in plants because they have the ability to self-pollinate quite often. Because they have animals in charge of delivering their pollen, they're not really choosing, they're not delivering the pollen themselves, so they kind of at the mercy of whatever lands there. And so they have this system where they can genetically prevent related individuals from fertilizing each other. So obviously this would have an important an important response to maybe some negative genetic effects of inbreeding. So it assures that matings happen between individuals that are a little more genetically different than usual. So we can look at this as a question of strategies. So we've seen plants falling on either end of the spectrum. Some plants are just fine with self-fertilizing all the time. Some never do that. And to be successful, it really just needs to benefit the plant maximally. Same way, the flower output and the number of resources that are put into sexual reproduction, those are also kind of honed over time by selection to be the most effective, most efficient way to get pollination and reproduction done. So think about, again, what the plant is looking for out of this arrangement. The plant needs to get its pollen delivered from the anthers to the stigma, maybe ideally from distantly related individuals or individuals that are farther away in space. So how do you get more outcrossing? How do you ensure that you get, I guess if you're looking for it, more self-fertilization? Let's see. So think about it first as a resources perspective. So we talked a bit about how plants have open access to the results of photosynthesis, right? So as long as you've got a plant that's got air and water and light, it should be able to do photosynthesis. But of course, plants are limited by something. So they're going to be limited by competition with their neighbors, or limited by soil nutrients or something like that. They might not be able to make all the resources that they could possibly make. They might just be limited by time. So there's a certain growing period in our environment where the plants are able to get to a certain size by the end of the year. And they have to kind of budget where they're going to put their tissues based on what they need out of those, what the whole plant needs. So there's a lot going on in this diagram, but I do like that it highlights the relative energy. So focus on energy here. The relative energy cost or reward or benefit depending on the organs. So over here we'll do source or sink. Maybe you've heard this term before. This is often referred to if there's like a flow of energy, the origin of the flow is the source, and then the end point is the sink. I don't know where all this energy is going down sinks, but that's that's the term we end up using. So the zones that are most clearly sources of energy, plus, maybe right here, mature leaves, definitely a plus for energy. So leaves take some energy to make a leaf, but that leaf pays back, right? It is the location where photosynthesis happens. And if you can build leaves, you should be able to get photosynthesis out of those. So this is a benefit to the whole plant, not just to the leaf itself, but the resources gained by that leaf go into the stem, they go into the roots, they go into the flowers. The roots, if you see here, from an energy standpoint, they're costly. So I guess kind of focus on photosynthesis. Maybe if you surveyed the roots, they would feel like they were being unfairly represented here, because of course the leaves can't do photosynthesis unless they have something, water from the roots. But emphasis on actually making that energy. So the roots are providing the raw materials for the water, in particular for the photosynthesis, but they are costly to produce. So costly to make the roots, costly to make the flowers. And I guess that's maybe one of the bigger ones, bigger take homes from this, is that leaves pay for themselves and pay for other parts of the plant. And the reproductive structures, again, from a making energy standpoint, flowers, the leaves associated with flowers, they're typically not really good at photosynthesis. Their purpose is much more for sexual reproduction. So this plant has to gather resources using its leaves for photosynthesis and then devote what it can to flowers and the associated production of structures related to that. So we can measure this as energy, percent nitrogen here as biomass. So biomass, hopefully you've seen that term before. This is just, again, like the mass of living material. If you want to see how much an organism has invested in a structure, as far as like how costly is it, how much carbon did you have to get out of the atmosphere to make the flowers that are part of your plant? That would be the measure of biomass devoted to reproduction. And we see a big variety as far as the number of flowers, the size of individual flowers. Again, I just want to kind of give you a spectrum of possibilities here. So larger number of flowers can get you a bigger floral display. But a larger number of flowers, if each flower is large, that ends up being very costly. So for the same amount of resources, you could do a display of many small flowers or a display of just a couple bigger flowers. And of course, this is dependent on the resources available to the plant, but I just want to kind of highlight the considerations. So besides that, of course, there, as we saw last time with pollination syndromes, there are different animals that would see these as viable flowers to visit. So a lot of considerations there. Flower duration. How long does a flower last after it is made? So some flowers, like magnolia, those are flowers that last. They are open as individual flowers for several days. And if you got in and experienced those petals, you see they're very durable or tough petals on this plant put together. They're built to last, and they're going to last a few days. Other plants, by contrast, this one is kind of notoriously short-lived, just a few hours on this spiderwort plant. And as you feel the petals, you can just tell they're delicate. As soon as this plant is too hot, the hot of the afternoon sun is too much for it, and the petals just start withering up. So the relative investment in petals that don't withstand the temperatures, that's relatively cheaper to make those petals, but you get less time performing as a flower as a result. So again, this is probably a system that works well for magnolia and works well for the Tradescantia spiderwort. Just a very different effect. So you can do, if you had a species, you could test the relative benefit of one of these structures. Like I like this study. So this is one of those field manipulations where they took a plant that has variation in whether or not it has these ray flowers around the outside. So these are the white parts are the rays, so-called. And sometimes this species has them, sometimes not. And actually, conveniently, it looks like the same kind of pollinator is visiting in both cases. So they said, all right, well, how important is this? And you can do manipulations and either add them back if they weren't there, or snip them off if they were there. And so in this population, they set up populations where there were some with and some without these rays, and pretty clean results. So this 3 stars means that there's about a 1 in 1,000 chance that that this would have happened by random. Big effect that flowers with the white rays had more flower visitors. Flowers with the white rays set more fruits, although it says non-significant, so I guess I shouldn't make too much of a comment on that. More, but not significantly different. Number of fruits, number of seeds, also not a significant difference, but definitely more flower visitors. So we talked about flower size, that's an investment. The reward is also an investment. How much pollen are you offering to your pollen-eating pollinators? How much nectar are you offering to your nectar-feeding visitors? We saw before the possibility that nectar is more or less rich in amino acids or sugars. So just straight up energy. This is a liquid energy being provided to animals. and it's costly. So the cost of attracting and rewarding animals is substantial, and some plants have chosen or evolved to not to reward or attract any animals, and instead to get pollinated by the wind. So this is a hazel catkin, lots and lots of male flowers here, small and few female flowers there. So pollination can happen here with the wind without having to attract any animals. And I guess the trade-off is that they're not getting delivery, so instead they have to trust that there's trust in a lot of pollen grains, and some of them are going to make it to where they need to be. All right, so pollinators, for their part, the animals can be very specific. They can be rather general, and depending. So if a plant can cultivate one of these specific pollinators and like behaviorally tie in their flower visits, then that has shown to be very effective in a few of these species. So we have an example of a yucca moth. This is a moth that has its reproductive life cycle tied in with the reproduction of this plant. This is a rather specific relationship where a bee is tricked using chemical pheromones, is tricked into visiting a flower that looks like a female, and it goes and tries to mate with it and gets pollen. So a very specific relationship. This plant is relying on this one animal species to do the visiting and the pollen transport. In contrast to those examples over here, just a nice illustration I found of a single plant species being visited simultaneously by at least 3 animal species. So 3 kinds of bees look like visiting, and maybe some other animals besides on there. So specific or general, different energy investments for those. I think we kind of talked about this before. This is an example of a hummingbird pollinated flower, and they did an experiment where they held back these flowers that looks like they kind of swing on a hinge to deposit pollen on the throat of a hummingbird. Probably best illustrated here with this illustration with the hummingbird approaching, and then as it goes in to access the nectar in the nectar spur, it ends up basically pulling this flower upwards, and these are the reproductive, the anthers with the pollen, and also the location where the stigmas would be getting brushed up against the throat of this hummingbird. So in the case here of animal pollinated versus wind pollinated, one of the examples of, or one of the effects of having this wind pollination is that a lot of pollen has been released into the world, and not a lot of it makes, like proportionally, not a lot of it makes it to a stigma, or this is likely pine pollen here, so not making its way to a structure that would get to the female, the ovule there. So In every case, if we're looking at the efficiency of transferring pollen, then it's important, I guess not every case, at least to budget for the plant to budget whether this pollen, as much pollen as it can, is getting to the place where it needs to be. So again, the abiotic pollination is a trade-off. It's an acceptable loss. So a lot of pollen is wasted, but energy is saved on not attracting animals, not rewarding animals. And you can see that as a ratio of the amount of pollen grains to the amount of ovules that are available. So I guess in a perfect world, every ovule gets a pollen grain to fertilize it. So that would be a 1-to-1 ratio. These are on the logarithmic scale. So log of 1 here would be 10 times as many pollen grains as there are ovules. 2, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. So a lot of cases, these examples, about 10,000 times, 1,000 to 10,000 times more pollen grains than there are ovules to be fertilized. So the numbers on the left-hand side here, the numbers that are lower, so it's actually the difference between 1,000 to 1 or 10,000 to 1, but still a substantial difference. The lower side of that is on these that have animals to deliver their pollen. So just even across the board, if we're looking at lots of different species, even the ones that have animals delivering their pollen, it's not a fantastic success of having just the right number of pollen grains transferred over to the stigma. There's still a lot wasted. So animals that eat pollen, pollen that drops off those animals, they might groom themselves on the way, pollen that falls out of the anther and doesn't hit the animal. So many ways for those pollen grains not to really get delivered in the best way. However, a little bit better, the average here you can see is still much lower than these other examples that are up more at the 10,000, 30,000 pollen grains to ovule ratio. So wind pollinated, some other examples. These examples, monoecious, dioecious, we'll skip those, but those are sometimes related to wind pollinated as well. A couple examples here. So autogamous, this is self-fertilizing. So self-fertilizing is getting now down to a low pollen ovule ratio of only about 100 to 1. So plants that fertilize themselves don't have to worry about producing a lot of pollen grains. And then in contrast, xenogamous, those outcrossing individuals, again, kind of like we saw in this group here. You know what, I think I'm going to call it. Some of this goes back to, well, why don't we do a little bit more? This is really relating more to what we covered already with pollination syndrome. This is a study that evaluated pollination syndrome, so it took a variety of measurements, and species with these different pollination syndromes, in fact, came out in different parts of the space there. So some evidence for them being different enough that it's not just something we can see with our eyes, but there's actually pretty well borne out with a variety of data that they're different enough, and probably indicating also that they're specialized on those types of pollinators. Kind of skipped the chance to talk about this one earlier. This is a orchid. So orchids are among the more, I don't know, wily of plants that get pollinated. This one tricks mosquitoes into pollinating it by smelling like body odor. So I guess get some of these in your yard. Your yard is going to smell like people, but you won't be visited by as many mosquitoes. Maybe you'll be visited by more mosquitoes. Who knew mosquitoes were pollinators, huh? And then this example, this is another group of orchids, and this is actually a lot of different orchid species that are all able to use the same animal pollinator by putting their pollen on precisely different parts of that animal as it visits them. So a little bit more on the specific relationship with pollinator in this example.